right, welcome again to AutoCrit 101. We are smack dab in the middle of this series. We have been working very hard on planning, writing, and editing, and today we are getting into copy editing. So if you have missed any of the classes before now, there is a link to the AutoCrit 101 replays that I believe Becca is going to drop for us in the chat. And if you're watching the replay, we will put that link under this video. So you'll go just scroll down a little bit and it should be there on the page for you so you can catch up with anything that you missed. We know that copy editing might seem daunting at a glance, but it doesn't have to be as scary as it sounds. And one of the beautiful things about AutoCrit is that it will help simplify your process. It gives you sort of those check mark boxes to go through and make sure you've run all your reports in one smooth place for your whole book. And you save yourself time instead of rereading your book over and over and over again, looking for all the different things we're going to talk about. So if you're a writer who's trying to self-edit your work, or if you're an editor doing this for a business and looking for a faster way to do this so you can help more clients and be more effective, then this is the place for you. And if you're not in editing yet, don't worry. We will all usually need these tools at some point, so save this, come back to it. I tell you guys though, masking tape over the backspace and the delete key while you're drafting. Wait to do your copy edit till you're happy with your content. That way you don't overwork. And as I said before we went live, we do have Kevin on here from the AutoCrit team as well. So we have here our book progress. You can see we have made quite a bit of progress by this point. We've been through our planning. We've been through the dev editing, which is your developmental editing for plot, pacing, world building, character development, things like that. We went through line editing last week, which was focused on your book's readability and flow on a line by line level. And today we are going into copy editing. Now, what is copy editing? Why do we do this? There's our dreaded red pen that you don't need if you're an AutoCrit. Could buy red pens. The point here is to strengthen your readability and flow, similarly to line editing. However, when you get to the copy editing level, you're doing this on a word by word level. You're wanting to make sure that you are using your words effectively, that you're being consistent with certain style choices you've made, that you aren't repeating yourself, that you're using dramatic, immersive language instead of summarized, told language. So we've got a lot to cover in a very, very short time today, and we're going to be focusing on all of that and how you can use your AutoCrit system to accomplish all those things. Now, just like a line edit, a copy edit is not meant to be your one-man editing army. If you are going to publish a book, especially if you're going to self-publish a book, you should not just pick up your copy edit and say, I'm only doing this level. I'm not going to do developmental. I'm not going to do a line edit. I'm not going to do a proofread. Each of these levels of edits are useful for a very specific purpose. If you skip developmental editing and just do a copy edit, you're missing out looking for things like plot holes and pacing that's slow or fast in places. You're missing things like dialogue tags. Are they clear? And do you have enough of them, or are you overusing them? And you are just getting down to the word level, so you're missing some core elements. So make the time to go back and do those edits that come before, and don't let this be your one and only edit or final edit in the end. Once you've finished all these word by word revisions, we do recommend having a proofread. There are many tools that can help you do proofreading for free. I use Google Chrome's built-in grammar and spelling checker for mine. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Or you can use a human proofreader. It's also not going to be where you focus on your formatting. This is not the time to be formatting. It is so hard to copy edit that focusing solely on the grammar is important here. Save your formatting for once you're finished with those other edits. Now, before we dive in too much, we're going to rehash what tools you might want to have available when you get into your copy editing phase, and then we'll pause for questions. So a couple things first, from a grammatical standpoint, having your style guide chosen in advance can help you create style guides for your own books and series that you can keep in your little notes section. We're going to talk about these as we go through AutoCrit today, and I will show you how I would do mine. These are things you're going to check for in the system, or that you would have checked for outside of the system if you were writing by hand or using Google Docs or something like that, to make sure that you meet your genre's industry expectations, right? For example, if I'm publishing fantasy here in the US, my book is typically going to be under the Chicago Manual of Style if I'm being traditionally published. That means that there are rules about using M dashes instead of parentheses. There are rules about using M dashes instead of the UK's N dashes, dashes being these different lengths. There's going to be rules for how I display active internal dialogue, internal thoughts with italics. There's going to be rules for things like whether you write in all caps, and if so, when and why. So these guides help dictate what your readers are going to look for, because that is what the publishing industry uses. And therefore, if you vary too far from that, readers might not think that your book has been edited, even though it could just be edited according to a different guide. So my personal recommendation, you can do what works best for you, is to look for the primary country you want to release your book in, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and look up what genre you have in that country and the word style guide. So if I'm publishing fantasy in the UK, I am going to be doing the New Oxford Style Guide or Style Manual instead of Chicago Manual of Style, where I'm now using single quotes instead of double for quotations. I'm using an N dash instead of an M dash. I'm using ellipses differently with spaces on either side. So those small notes just are things to keep in mind and reflect on as you go through. We'll talk about how you can set all that up. As part of your style sheet, which is what we're going to talk about, you want to identify how you want to format names and titles. Are you going to capitalize Lord so-and-so, Lady so-and-so, Your Highness, Your Majesty, Master, Mistress, Dad, Mom? Are you going to leave them lowercase? What kind of punctuation and font notes do you have? Are you going to use the old Oxford comma, even though Chicago Manual of Style has written it out except for serial commas? Are you going to add the extra S to the end of a name ending in S that has an apostrophe? Those little questions fall into the style sheet. Personal words and phrases that you want the system to look for. And let's pull up AutoCrit for a second, and I'm going to show you where you're going to track some of these things. That way you have them on hand to run down as you're going through your book. So here is the AutoCrit homepage. And there's lots of good information. There's blog posts on here. We just announced our novel 90 grand prize winners last night. So congratulations to them. You can see who they are there. And the calendar events are on here. But today we're going over to the writer's desk. That's on the left-hand side. Now, if you are in the copy editing phase, we are going to assume you already have a completed book. If you did not already upload that book into AutoCrit, you can upload it in an image-free, unformatted file as a docx, as a .txt, or as a .rtf here. You can also copy and paste into a blank file if you would like. And if you haven't written your book yet, you can save yourself all that carryover trouble just by writing directly here in the system, which is my first choice. Back out right here. Okay. So if I'm creating a style sheet to edit this specific book, for example, I am going to make heavy use of notes. I'm going to go over here to my notes, and I'm going to make this note board full screen. You got a couple options for how you want your notes to be displayed. So when you create a note, you can either have this corkboard style, or you can do a timeline style. And I can say style sheet to-do list. Now, the style sheet to-do list that I personally keep is the same for every book. And as I finish things, I strike it out. So I'm going to write down in here up front, remember to do these elements. So maybe I'll make this first column punctuation. I'm writing a book that's going to be primarily released in the UK right now because 60% of my readers are in the UK. So I want to make a note about quotation marks. And down here, I'm going to say change double quotes to single. And save that. You can color code this. You can put a whole bunch of different styles in here. That's going to save it there. And then maybe I want to create another thing under quotation marks. Active internal dialogue, my internal thoughts. Italics, double quotation marks, if I'm following this specific style guide. And if you're in Chicago, that would be italics only. And so then as you start reading through your book, you have your note board right there. And you can look at it at a glance. Here it is. You don't have to open it up full screen. You can even do bookmarks if you want to go chapter by chapter. And let's say I've corrected everything down to here. And I can create a bookmark and say something like resume here. So I'm going to link it to my style sheet. I'm going to choose this note and I'm going to save right there. There is my note. Here's what I'm supposed to be doing. Left off here, pick back up. So that way I can work through it at my own pace. When you come back into AutoCrit, you would go to bookmark. This is a tool that I have come to really love over the last quarter. This is my first AutoCrit 101 really sharing it. You can view all your bookmarks right here in a row and go to the one you want without having to click next comment, next comment, next comment, next comment, next comment to get to them. So that makes it super helpful on that dev editing level. So this is how you would do setting up your style, getting your style sheet together, getting it ready, and then come down here again to your custom word list. Here is where you're going to include things like personal words and character names that you would like set up for this copy editing level. If you finish editing for names or dialogue or a specific word and you don't want it included on the other reports anymore, you can go and add it to an exclude list as well. And that way you won't see that popping up over and over in the repetition. All right, so I'm going to pause here, go back to our slides and answer any questions you have now that we've finished the organization before we dive into our copy editing reports. What have we got? And Kevin or Becca, let me know if you see anything that I've missed. I know these jump around a lot while I'm looking down. There is voice to text dictation. Sherry, if there's time at the end of today's call, I'll show some of those tools as well. And of course, the planning and drafting video in the AutoCrit 101 replays has too. Never gonna give up your Oxford comma. An exclude example could be a name. And in my books, I write fantasy and I use a lot of fantasy language and words. For example, there's a language that you use to cast wishes, and those words are often picked up as typos, and they are usually done in these like poetic styles, so they're sort of repetitive. If I don't want them on the repeated words report, I would put those in the exclude list, and that way it's not going to keep popping up. What is the link to AutoCrit? Can someone share the link to AutoCrit for Charlotte? It should be www.autocrit.com for the people watching the replay. Or if you're watching the replay, you're probably already logged into AutoCrit as well. So we can copy notes for style guide to other books. I like that. All right. The next time I pull it up, I will show you how you will do that. If there's nothing else, Kevin, I'm going to keep going. Do you see anything I've missed?
No, actually, it's pretty quiet out there. So any questions you have, just pop them in.
Okay. All right. So let's continue on. I did see a question about formatting. We will get to that closer to the end of today's call. So we have seen your comment. Where does your book fit in? Remember, if you were here last week, that your genre determines the reader expectations for how you edit your book and how you word your book, and for things like pacing, which is what we talked about last time. So the good thing about a tool like AutoCrit is that it compares your book to the specific genre or author that you're trying to release your book to. And you can see how close you are to that average. And that score can then help you make informed decisions about the changes that you put in your book before you make those changes. Anybody can tell you, hey, you should have less adverbs, you should show more than you tell, but just how many they mean is going to vary. So I'm going to show you an example of what that score looks like. I'm going to talk about what the score means, and then we'll move on. I went over this in detail last week in line editing, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it today. But since we're going to open up today's talking about adverbs, we're going to pull this report first. So right now, this is a fantasy book, and I'm comparing it with fantasy. And as you can see, I use the exact same amount of adverbs in a piece this size that fantasy would use in a piece this size. I am spot on the norm. If I was over, that would mean that I use more than the average. If I'm under, that means I use less than the average. And the overall score is available in the analysis under the summary report. This is going to give you an overall score of how similar you are to the genre or author you've selected. There's two options here. The comparing directly against that genre, and then adding industry expert advice as well as customer review feedback into this score. So overall, for all the different things, my story here is 85.5% similar. That is about as high as I want it to be personally. Every author has their own different take on it, but I've seen a lot of the trad published scores that have been shared through AutoCrit fall in the mid 70s to mid 80s. And it's because every book needs its own unique voice, right? We want to not be 100% perfect or we're losing some of our originality. So I am okay keeping 15 to 25% difference between me and my comparing with authors. Now, I do start to worry if that number drops below 75%, like this strong writing score is down at 72, or if it's too high up in the 100. So I wouldn't go in here aiming to get a 100% similarity score per se, but this can help you identify the key areas you need to start improving on. So for example, I have much faster paced paragraphs than most readers would expect from a fantasy. That is purposeful. I want my books to read fast paced like Sanderson, but then in every other style preference, read like George R. R. Martin, because I pay ad dollars to advertise to those two authors' readers. And a Brandon Sanderson reader may not have the patience to wade through a George R. R. Martin book. They are super slow paced compared to the average fantasy book. So on this regard, I'm lower, but I'm okay being lower because it's a purposeful choice. I do know, though, that that means that if a George R. R. Martin reader picks up my book, they might feel like it's faster paced than they're used to. And readers don't know that that's because of the length of the paragraph or the number of run on sentences. They're just like, oh, it's fast, or it's slow, or it's boring, or it's rushed. Watch out that your pacing is not a reflection of how fast you move through your story. So you can scroll through, get an idea for where you're over, where you're under, how much dialogue you use compared to the average, and things like that. If you want to see an in-depth view of this, go back and watch the replay for line editing. All right. So once you know what your genre expectations are, you can start to make those informed decisions about when you want to cut something out, when you want to add something in, or when you want to replace it with something else as part of the actual editing process. And we're going to start out with repetition. So repetition can occur when you have phrases occurring too close together, or you use the same word too much overall or too close together overall, right? So there are reports that can help you pinpoint this. There are over 20 different technical editing reports in AutoCrit right now, so you can spend some time working through them and just go down. I have my personal list that I go through and what order linked to the AutoCrit 101 replay link that Becca shared earlier in this call, but you can do your reports in whatever order you would like. I start with repetition though, because repetition and showing versus telling and adverbs require a little more revision than some other reports. So if I go here and I go to repeated words, this report is going to break down how many times I repeat words close together. And you can see the same word on this list more than once because it's going to show it in the instance that it shows up, right? So we're going to start here. I use Freya's name 5 times, super close together. And by this report standards, that's usually within a paragraph or two apart. Do I need to use her name 5 times? Well, that's going to be dependent on the use. So instead of just taking them out, I have to click the name and start reading it and go, okay, Freya is up here. Visually, I think it's okay if it's down here. Reading over the sentences, I'm still okay with this usage, so I'm not necessarily going to cut this out. Now, these down here, they feel like they're less, there's less space between them. So Freya grimaced at the ignorance in a statement, even if the night. I'm going to shift this around, make it a little original, keep that repetition from standing out so jarringly. In this case, I'm doing this solely because of how it looks. It still needs to be clear that the person is changing. The last named person was the King Regent. So we do need to clarify that there's a change, but I don't have to use her name to get that across. Up here, you can see that I've got much close together. I have plate close together. I have likely close together down here. So as you go through these reports, ask yourself, do I need to have them this close? Can I replace this word? I am under average, so I actually don't want to really take much out, or I'm going to become more and more different from the genre's norm. Instead, I'm going to start highlighting words that I'm not sure what to replace with and clicking the Smart Thesaurus, and that will read the sentence and give me suggestions catered to that sentence, right? So this is a masterful set and likely much more comfortable, needs likely, in my opinion. So if I'm going to change one of these, I want to change this top one. So I'm going to go up here instead. I'm going to highlight this one, and it's going to reread. And instead of giving me the same suggestion, it might give me a different suggestion based on that context. So had presumably, had doubtless, and I cut it out there by clicking the wrong button on my computer, doubtless spent long hours making the custom. That flows very naturally for epic fantasy, and it doesn't have the repetition, and it flows well with my unique author voice. So you can go through and work through your reports that way. Phrase frequency, similar to repeated words, is going to be looking for phrases. And I believe those are 3-word phrases, Kevin, or more that are close together.
Yes, they are. That's absolutely right.
You can catch your pet phrases. This is how I caught whirling and twirling, and the hair kept rising on these characters' arms in one of my books. It just kept flagging it. This phrase has been used this many times close together. I'm like, why?
And the cool thing too, Catherine, I don't know if you showed it yet, but if we're looking for like unusual phrases, um, if like some real common phrase that you have that doesn't show up, perhaps you want to just specifically find those, you can add that to your personal words. You can add your own phrase and run your personal words, and it will actually look for whatever phrase you want it to look for.
Yeah. Yeah. So I do purposefully do whirling and twirling in my personal words and phrases reporting now, because there should not be so much whirling and twirling in a dark fantasy book. She whirled around. Speaking of things that should not be too used, besides whirling and twirling, we're getting into adverbs now. There's a couple different places where AutoCrit will point out adverbs, and these adverbs are used differently. There are going to be adverbs in dialogue. Adverbs in dialogue can be extremely helpful for making sure that readers know the tone of voice you say something in, especially in a sentence that could be vague. So if a parent opens a door, walks in the kitchen, and their child is standing in the middle of a room with chocolate everywhere, The corresponding reply could be one of many things, but if it was something more vague along the lines of what happened here, and there's no follow-up tag with adverbs in it, we don't know if this is a just lighthearted parent who's like, oh, what happened here? We don't know if this is an angry parent going, what happened here? We don't know if this is a frustrated or overstressed or tired parent going, oh, what happened here? We need that adverb, but you also don't want to overuse it either. Adverbs work best in moderation, and they work best in cases where they are strengthening your piece instead of replacing strong word choices, right? So we are checking adverbs for two things: to make sure that we have enough, and to make sure that they're adding emotion, that they're adding to the drama, that they're adding to the immersion and not replacing your shown description. So to check for your adverbs in dialogue, you're going to click the dialogue tab and click adverbs in dialogue right here. You can see I have a problem not using adverbs. I blame my mother for this because she was an editor, and growing up, she would be like, adverbs are the road to hell, and be like, okay, we aren't going to use them. And now I have to go add them in. So if you're like me and you maybe got on that train of all adverbs are evil, you might be surprised to learn that some genres, especially romance and horror, use adverbs, and they use adverbs quite liberally. If you are missing adverbs, go to the dialogue and start looking for particularly powerful statements and ask yourself, can this be something that I can reword in a way that uses a strong adverb? Right now, I have nonsense, the king regent huffed, his smile only spreading further until he looked like a nightmarish ghoul. There's a lot of emotion and description going on in here. So I could technically, if I want this to be a stronger sentence, make that sentence too. The king regent said, um, malignantly. And I'm adding a tone of voice that was up to reader interpretation before. Huffed leaves this impression of him pouting, but he's grinning. So he's not pouting. I wasn't clear there with my word choice. So he said angrily, he said malignantly, he said slyly, and then all of those things paint a different mental image, depending on which one I use, of the smile that spreads over his face. So it paints the whole scene in a different light. So if you're looking for those missing adverbs and dialogue, that's my personal tip. Look through your dialogue. It'll list every single one out. Look for ones that really should have something emotional and say, can I add this in here? All right. Outside of adverbs in dialogue, we have what we typically consider when we think of adverbs, which is adverbs in your narrative, in your prose. So in this example, she smiled happily as he gently whispered in her ear. Got two different adverbs here. Smiled happily, he gently whispered. You can shift that told summary where we have summarized their emotions and their reactions into an immersive shown description instead, that conveys the same thing but adds power again to that scene, that makes us feel what they feel and actually visualize it a little better. Smiled happily is sort of redundant. We will talk about redundancies as part of this. AutoCrit has a report for redundancies. Smiled happily. I mean, if you're smiling, unless it's not um, it's like a smile that doesn't meet their eyes or something that isn't happy, we're going to assume that they're happy. It's a happy smile if you just say smile. Instead, let's make this stronger. A grin. So his whispered words ruffled her hair. We now have a visual image in our head of her hair ruffling while he's whispering in her ear, and a grin spread across her face. We get the implied happiness, we get the type of smile, and we also get that visual cue, the grin spreading across her face there. All this talk of adverbs, and I'm going to show you the adverb report in just a minute, often gets confused with generic descriptions. So we're going to look at the two together. Adverbs are usually describing an emotion or a action or reaction to something in summary instead of dramatizing it and showing us how that should be. Generic descriptions are talking about what things look like, how things sound, how they smell, sensations, and we sometimes just summarize it down instead of getting specific with it. So he looked nice. Well, that's very subjective. What looks nice to one person may not look nice to somebody else. So how exactly did they look? She smelled good. The food smelled delicious. What exactly does it smell like? Does she smell like fresh cut grass and a swimming pool? Does she smell like a wood shop? Does she smell like something that's baked that reminds this person of something they used to love? Um, the sensations. It felt good. Well, what exactly is happening? What is the physical response? I shuddered in pleasure. Hair rose on their arms. We talked about that one earlier. Just don't overuse it. It was hot. It was scorching. Sweat pours down their throats, or down their throats, down their arms. Let's go in horror here. So you can be specific in both how you show things on an adverb level and how you experience things on a generic description level. So in AutoCrit, there's a report for both of those things. They are separate. The adverb report is going to be under strong writing. Let's go back over here and we're going to click adverbs. And this is going to show you all your adverbs. You can go through and say, okay, right now I have one more adverb than the average because I added that one to that dialogue tag. Down here, it's telling you how many times that genre or author that you've chosen with comparing over here would use these specific words. That does not mean you need to cut those words out. This is not a, this word is bad. This is a indication of, hey, they don't usually use the word barely in a fantasy piece this size. And that's okay. I like that word. I'm going to keep that word. Maybe I don't want 4 instances of it. So if I start clicking on it, you can see 1, 2, 3 close together. Maybe I need to change that or take some out. But you have the creative decision. It's the beautiful thing of AutoCrit. The system will not write or rewrite your piece for you. It's not going to generate any part of your book for you. You remain in 100% creative control of your work. So 3 ships, barely visible. Freya barely caught her arm. Brace and tumbled, barely keeping her feet. So if I'm going to want to change any of these, because again, I don't know that I want to cut very many out being so close to the average, you can go back to that Smart Thesaurus, get an idea of what you want to do there as well. All right. So what was the other one? Generic descriptions, I believe. All right. Generic descriptions is under word choice because you are choosing stronger words. You're going to see generic indicators: looked, seems, sounds, great, powerful, very, pretty, make it as pretty as possible. In this case, I like that. I'm going to leave it. But if it was, she looked pretty, I might go into specifics. She looked beautiful in insert thing she was wearing. Being far too powerful for him to ignore. This isn't a good example. Powerful in what way? Was protected by beings far too powerful to him for him to ignore. I might leave that, but then I need to follow it up with why. What are these beings? How are they more powerful? How can they not ignore them? So in that case, you might want to create a bookmark so that you can come back and do this later. This is Act 1. So I could come in here and start a new note and say, why are they too powerful? And I can leave myself an inline comment, select it, and save it. And that will tag it on here so that once I'm finished running through my entire report, I can come back and see, oh yeah, I wanted to expand on that concept because it's not clear right now. All right, I'm going to pause here. I know that those are a lot of the reports that people spend their time on in the copy edit. We are going to go through a few more, but I want to make sure that I have any burning questions from you guys. Remember that the summary when it comes to adverbs and generic description is dramatize, bring us into the scene immersively. Don't summarize. Um,
Catherine, we had one question. It kind of steps us back a little bit, but back to when you were looking at the overall scores in the summary report and other things like that. It was do you vary your target scores for like YA versus adult readers or something like that? And I think there's a just the clarification that comes to play here is the scores we have already adjusted for each specific genre and or author you compare to. So every time you switch your genre or author you're benchmarking against, you will get a new number. And the numbers will also adjust automatically as well. It's not like there's only one. Every single element we have in AutoCrit has its own unique patterns and set of statistics that we go with. So every time you change something you're comparing to, you're literally changing all the stats that you're going to be looking at. So it adjusts for you automatically.
yeah, and there is a YA genre in here.
Yep.
So if I was writing YA fantasy, I would run it through fantasy for almost everything. But there are some things that are different in YA, and those things are specifically your pacing, the amount of dialogue you use, and showing versus telling. Those three things. You tell a lot more in YA than you do in adult. You still have to show, but YA readers have not yet aged up to that group where 100% is left to the imagination and you have to infer everything. So writers often summarize a powerful emotional statement with the summarized tell that the reader should have picked up on. And it's a way to train them to get them out of that middle grade chapter book that does tells all the time into adult fiction. It bridges that gap. So if you're writing YA and you're writing YA fantasy, YA horror, YA mystery, YA sci-fi, I would run it through the general fantasy or sci-fi or mystery genres and then come back and run YA for those specific areas. And thank you, Becca. Yes, if you want to try any of these reports that we're showing today, we do have a special trial running right now. So we dropped the link to that in the chat and you can hop in here, start running reports, play around with it. If you get stuck, there's a little help bubble in the bottom right corner. I'll pull it out the next time we shift over and show where that is.
We had another question, Catherine, which is a little more subjective, I guess. Exclamation points. We don't really look for punctuation in AutoCrit per se. Like on our we're looking usually for words and word patterns and things like that. But something like an exclamation point is a little bit of a hot topic for some people. Some people say you shouldn't have but maybe 3 in every 100,000 words. Like some people are very sparse with it, and they're saying maybe the action and the dialogue itself or the words you choose should convey whether or not it was said in excitement or someone who was scared for that matter. And other people say, they're fine. And once again, some of it has to do with maybe it's YA versus other. I mean, some some audiences like exclamation points. I mean, you look at people that are texting these days; they're all over the place, right? You can't get enough exclamation points. So it's kind of a personal preference. However, in AutoCrit, you can, and I kind of recommend doing this if you think this is a problem you have. You can do on the find and replace option in the right sidebar. You can actually search for punctuation. So you could search for your exclamation points and just go through at the end after you get done and just check to make sure that they belong on the page. Or maybe you could strengthen the action, the description of what the character is doing a little bit more. Maybe they slam the door. Maybe you don't have to say the exclamation point in the dialogue because they already showed, that they're angry or some sort of other way of emoting that besides the exclamation point. But honestly, it's kind of a personal preference. What's your thoughts on that, Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, I think every style guide has slightly different takes on it too. It's more important if you're going to trad publish. Self-published authors have some more creative leeway. If you're going to trad publish, and the publisher pushes back, get rid of half your exclamation marks and or the corresponding tags. I think when I was in editing class, what we were sort of taught at that time is if you follow with a tag that says yelled, screamed, shrieked, cried, whatever that is, you don't need the exclamation mark. You can just put your comma like always and put she shrieked. If you don't have a tag, the exclamation mark can be helpful to set aside the emphasis. And an exclamation mark is typically more preferred than all caps because the exact same mental tone comes through if I read stop with an exclamation mark than if I read stop in all caps. And it just flows a little better. And most style guides don't use all caps for shouting. So they use all caps for other things. So just creative decisions, maybe a little researching. I've absolutely seen it in dialogue for sure. Just watch your use of them, and you definitely don't need 4 or 5 of them, unless it's a handwritten note or a text message within your thing where somebody's like, "Help!" 5 exclamation marks. Just regular help with 1 exclamation mark is plenty to give your reader that shouting emphasis for sure.
And I think too, it comes to a little bit consistency too, right, Catherine?
Mm.
Perhaps um, you have a character that speaks a certain way, or maybe you're trying to show that the difference between the two. It's okay, but you got to be really, really careful of overusing these things because it can go down a cliff. You'll like fall off a cliff, and before you know it, you'll start annoying your readers really fast. So
Right.
it's one of those things where it's consistency, but not overdoing it. I think is less is usually better than more with regard to these type of things.
Yeah. If you
And
use
this
it
goes to
too
anything,
much,
like including ellipses and all. If you overdo any of your kind of punctuation in your, I think it kind of goes along the same lines. You got to be certainly careful of constructing your sentences and your paragraphs and things in a certain nature that requires all these additional punctuation. Be cautious of that because that's usually a red flag that maybe I didn't um, my structure of my sentence isn't tight enough as it is. I'm kind of
mhm,
piecing it together with duct tape per se to try to convey what I should have been able to do with just simple language. You're almost always better off using words in simple language than punctuation.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Consistency is key. Not overusing it is key, and saving it so that when the emphasis is actually needed, it stands out.
Yep.
If someone's fighting in a big battle, or in the middle of a giant fight, we know they're going to be shouting unless you tell us otherwise. We're going to assume it's shouting because you've described the noise, you've described the chaos. So the only time you really need that exclamation mark is when you're stressing that this is louder than the other sounds. This is the more urgent than the other sounds. The rest can get the standard comma or period and then the tag if you're going to use one. And we know automatically. I mean, we're automatically thinking that. So you don't need every single quote in a big fight scene to have, that exclamation mark just as an example there. All right. Great
Okay.
questions. So we're going to talk about staying active in our word choice here. We've got a few things. I mentioned that we were getting into redundancies earlier. We're also going to talk about passive voice and filler words. Essentially, these are things that creep into our writing that just keep our word choices from being active. And it makes the narrator seem like a passive narrator, and they're often just not needed. It's excess word that you can cut out. So let's share these. Earlier, I said smiled happily, right, is a redundancy because unless I say otherwise, a reader's going to read the word smiled and assumed that that means happy. So there are some things that just don't need to be said. So I'm going to go back over here to my strong writing. I'm going to go to redundancies. And the system is going to pull out potential redundancies if you have one. Well, apparently I picked a bad example for that. Hold on. I've got other books with other things. So, dun, dun, dun. All right, redundancies. Come on, Splitting Dawn. Show me some redundancies. At least one. I didn't think I had a book with no redundancies. That's great. All right, here we go. 17 of them. As I asked. All right. These, like some of our other reports, could be indicators. These are word choices we typically see when something is redundant. That doesn't mean that 100% of the time you've had a redundancy, so you do need to click through them and read. Each and every. Here we go. Each and every is a bit overdramatic. It's why it's here on the list. There's other more succinct ways to imply that without saying it outright. Living with a father who abused his wife to such a mortifying extent each and every day. Okay, yes, that is overdramatic. I don't really need each and every. So I'm just going to change it to every. and I've become more succinct. I have not changed the meaning of the sentence at all. I've just removed unnecessary emphasis here, and that strengthens the word. Sometimes less is more, right? Brief moment. Whispers followed a brief moment of silence. On the fence. Maybe I'll come back to that one. And a brief moment of night sky. While around them the sky was light and with sun and clouds, a brief moment. Brief moment seems odd here because we're describing a setting and moment is time. So a brief glimpse of night sky might be better because it keeps us in the visual cues of this sentence. One thing I haven't shown today, I know I showed it last week in line editing. Some of these reports we know are going to be new concepts to people doing this. If you get lost, there is the help bubble down here on the right. You can search for articles here. You can chat with our support team here if you need help. But there's also this information bubble to the right of all our reports. If you click that bubble, you'll be greeted often with a little video. It'll give you an example of what that report means and walk you through examples of ways to fix the things that are in here, as well as if there are any exceptions to the rules where you do need to leave it, even if it's redundant, right? For your unique author voice. So you can do this for adverbs, you can do this for redundancies, whatever you need. If you just need a little jog of what you're supposed to be doing, check there. And if you still have questions, hit the help bubble. See what we can do to help, because we are always happy to help with things like
Yeah,
that.
definitely. If you're not sure, look at that first before you go through 100,000 words and tearing up your manuscript. Because not all this stuff that AutoCrit finds is wrong. That's the beauty of this. A lot of this is gray areas, and you're going to leave 75% of it, perhaps. Maybe you're only going to correct 25%. But it's really important to know what we're looking for and what you should be looking for to see if it's an issue.
Mhm. Yep. Playing into this, we had a couple other reports here. Passive indicators, we talked about those. This is when you are potentially slipping into passive voice instead of having an active narrator's voice. And of course, now I'm writing a little bit longer of a book. It's going to take it a couple minutes more, but here I use way less passive voice. For me personally, passive voice is something that I've had to learn how to improve, how to include it in my book, because readers rely on passive voice for things, especially dialogue, to sound natural. When you and I have a conversation, we use passive voice a lot. When a narrator talks, we don't expect it as much. But if I don't have passive voice in my dialogue from time to time, it's just going to sound weird. So I've had to do the reverse of what you may do if you have too many, which is go in and figure out, where do I need to have this? Is this too grammatically correct to where it doesn't flow naturally anymore? Like, who'd do that to somebody versus who would do that to somebody? So you'd be looking at the opposite of the words on this list. Typically, though, I'm going to go through here if I have too many and look for cases outside of dialogue. I do have my dialogue highlighted. That's what these gray portions are. I'm looking for parts in the narrative prose that have who'd, when I could potentially split it up if I have too many. It was the hooded man, the one who'd been disguised as a ribbon. Who'd been, who was disguised as a ribbon, unless it's perfect past tense, which means it was past tense within a past tense story. You don't really need passive phrasing. You use that something had twice in the case of a book like this where it was past tense already, and now I'm going to show you a flashback or talk about something that happened even earlier than that scene. And then the last report that I talked about in this section is unnecessary filler words. So the unnecessary filler words is similar to passive. You're looking for words that don't have to be there, that you could replace with a stronger instance of that word. It's typically aligned with an adjective or a verb. So for example, going down here, that even his vampire eyes couldn't make out. This one's tied to the adjective, so thick that even his vampire eyes, I can cut this one out altogether if I wanted to. It adds nothing to the sentence. If I give you the sentence and you read, the darkness was so thick that his vampire eyes couldn't make out, um, you might say, all right, I want that emphasis there. Or you could say, I get it. He's a vampire and even he doesn't see through it. It doesn't change all that much. So when I'm making these decisions, I'm asking myself, does the context of the sentence change if you cut out this filler word? If the answer is no, then you don't need the word most likely. If it's yes, you can ask yourself, can I shift my verbiage to make a stronger word? Take my life, just spare hers. That's dialogue. Hung suspended just beyond the city gates. Hung suspended beyond the city gates. Just beyond the city gates. Do I want to leave that? Do I want to make this outside? So on the cobblestone beneath the city gates? Am I going to make this something more specific, something more visual? So many ways you can adjust these depending on what your style preferences are.
Hey,
Um,
Catherine, can you bring that up one more second? We had a question
yeah,
regarding the recommendations.
okay,
Sure. Yeah. So the recommendations here on the right sidebar, say for that, we have 386, or even we had 107, remove 23. This is based on your word count of 53,000 and change words.
yeah.
Okay. So if you had 100,000 words, it would double everything because it would be twice as many words. So the results are relative to the amount of words you have. If Catherine had 500 words in here and not 50,000, and she would only be allowed maybe two of the use of the word even. It adjusts based on how many words you have. So you don't have to worry about, I only have 2,000 words. Is that going to, the results going to be relative? Yes. We normalize everything compared to the number of words you have, not compared to the number of words we have in our system.
So you can
So I
see
think,
that it's adjusted mine. I just
yeah,
took off one chapter and now it says I have 105, remove 23. It's going to shift around based on what's actually there compared to the norm.
yep, based on your word count. So no worries about that.
Yep. All right. Great question. And yes, you can change this. Go to comparing with genre, type in whatever you'd like. Horror, we talked about young adult. We've got nonfiction in here as well. You can do specific authors. Like I told you guys, I go Brandon Sanderson for my pacing and I do George R. R. Martin for everything else. And so when I run against Brandon Sanderson, I run my pacing reports. And then I don't worry about my scores when I have Martin selected in the pacing section because I want them to be different, right? Same thing if you're running that young adult we talked about earlier. Um, if you want it to be different, just look at what applies there. So there are a couple other tips that I have, and then we're going to break for questions before we hop off because we only have a few minutes left. I cannot stress enough reading your book to yourself as part of your editing process because as the writer and even as a professional editor, when we read a book too many times, our brain starts auto-correcting errors that would be easily caught up. The first book I ever put out had a typo, T-E-H, te, in the first sentence. I guarantee you I didn't do that again. And it was quickly resolved. My proof copy came through. Another sign of why you need a proof copy before you send out the final. I got my proof copy in and there was a te in line one. And I go, how did I miss that in line one? And it's just because your brain autocorrects it. It genuinely does. So AutoCrit has the ability to use an editorial e-reader built into the system for free if you have AutoCrit Pro. And like most good editorial e-readers, there's about a 200 word cap. After about a page, most editorial readers will cut off and give you a chance to correct errors because you might start losing track of errors. There's only so many errors your brain can hold without pausing to fix them before you start missing things, right? And that's the whole purpose. So you can highlight a section of up to about 200 words, click the editorial e-reader button, choose a voice you like, and go ahead and have it read it. And then pause, fix anything you heard, and then do it again. And not only this, but I recommend doing it backwards. That's my personal Catherine recommendation because if you're not caught up in your story and you're not starting at the beginning, you're less likely to pause to fix this plot point could be stronger, this description could be better. That's not what you're focusing on in the copy editing phase. That's done. You've given yourself permission to let it go. So start at the end and work up. Take the last few paragraphs, fix those, and then move up from there on your book. And that way you're listening for actual errors and you're correcting actual technical errors, if that helps. Next week, we're going to do a whole class on formatting here in AutoCrit 101. That's already up on the chapter. You can use, or on the calendar, you can use AutoCrit to format your book for a print-ready PDF or for EPUB. I have tried this. It's fantastic. It's super easy to use and fill out. So I'm going to walk you through how you can do that and some things to think about as part of your formatting process. Between now and next week, if you were finishing your copy edits, congratulations. You might want to consider going ahead and doing whatever proofreading you would like. If you're going to use a human proofreader, go ahead and get them set up before you format your final version for publication. And with that, we're going to pause and take any questions before we hop off. We've got a couple minutes.
I think we might be caught up on this one now, Catherine.
Awesome. Surprise punctuation, question mark, exclamation mark, single, single.
I think we did a whole class on punctuation one time, didn't we, Catherine? That's a whole other.
Oh, how did we do? Okay, let me go ahead and show how you do the read aloud feature.
Oh, sure.
Since we've got that extra minute here. So if you pull up your page and you highlight a couple paragraphs, about 200 words worth, if you go over here underneath the dictate button, that's where you click to do your voice to text. You're going to click the text reader. Now, first you can set up any text options you want underneath it. Choose the voice that works best for you. Then under the text reader, and you can see it will read off. Now, it's also not meant to be an entertainment. Let me stop this. It's not meant to be an entertainment e-reader. You catch more errors when it doesn't flow like a natural person speaking all the time. There are some great voices that sound pretty natural in here, but I purposefully choose the ones that don't flow 100% right because it helps my brain catch errors easier. So listen through the voices to find the one that you pay the most attention to because you don't want to tune out. That is my biggest advice. If you're doing audible editing, you don't want to tune out and just let the story go in the background, or you're missing the point, which is to catch grammatical errors and typos. And sometimes those are subtle. So definitely do that. Find the one that works best for you to stay tuned in and actively listening. I try to read along as I'm hearing, so that way I can note where I'm going to come back and make the changes when I hear something that doesn't work. But yeah.
We had another question here, Catherine. And it's a big one, but we can end it on it, I guess. When we just went through all this editing, and we just actually tip of the iceberg, some of the reports that AutoCrit has. But when do you do this in the process? Like, when should I write 3 chapters and then start editing like this, or what? And I think it varies per person. It's a very personal question. But my recommendation always is whatever doesn't stop the flow of actually completing the book. Number one is write the book first before you do anything. So if you haven't finished your book yet, you got to be super careful not to fall into an editing trap and then get stuck and then never finish your book. That's the worst thing you could possibly have happen. That's worse than any typo or anything that you can put out there, is not actually finishing the book. So there's no chance anybody's going to read it if you don't finish it. So that's number one. So if you're the kind of person that likes to step back and pause writing, that's great. But some people get stuck, right, Catherine? Like, if you once you're in the flow of getting it on the page, sometimes you don't want to stop.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a pantser, so I don't know where the story's going, and I also don't write chronologically. So for me personally, to stop and get caught up in editing loses train of thought, and there's a higher and higher potential that the book won't get done. Instead, I literally do put masking tape over my backspace and delete keys. It doesn't keep you from pressing the buttons, but when my finger hits it, because my inner editor turns on unconsciously, I'm like, oh yeah, this isn't editing time. This is writing time. I let it sit, and I know that means it's going to be a garbage mess when it's done, but that's okay. I personally just want the complete thing done before I lose my inspiration to do it. And then I go back and use the reverse outlining. We did a whole class on that to reorder my mess, to find what needs to be fixed. And then I walk through this process. First, my developmental edit, then my line edit, and then what we did today in the copy edit. And I have a checklist that's linked to the AutoCrit 101 replays of which order I run all of these reports in. And I don't give myself permission to skip ahead. I check one off and then I do the next one and then I do the next one. And having that rigid process gives me permission to not have to have a perfect book. And it keeps me out of that cycle that Kevin's talking about, where you've rewritten the first chapter so many times that it looks like it could be sitting on a bookshelf. And then the second half of your book is an absolute mess because you never get there. You just rewrite the first version and you're such a better writer by the time you get done with the first chapter that it doesn't even look like the second half was written by the same person. And then you get overwhelmed because it's so much different. And then you don't want to do it anymore. And that's tragic. Um,
Yeah. Or
and
you,
then
or you,
people,
if you break it up so much, Catherine, you get plot holes. You forget your
exactly.
train of thought, and then maybe characters disappear by accident, or maybe somebody died somewhere, and you bring them back to life by accident because you took 3 weeks to breaking up your line of thought. But it's not everybody. Like clearly, some people are maybe writing nonfiction or something else that might be a little more structured. You can step back and forth, but really the creative process. There's a thought out there that you're using different parts of your brain when you're editing versus when you're actually writing. So some people can juggle that ball back and forth easily, and some people can't. So it's kind of really a personal thing, I think, for
Oh,
sure.
yeah. And I've heard of writers who reward themselves by editing if they get their word count goal. I've heard of writers who finish a chapter and then the next morning they edit that chapter and then they write a new chapter and they don't let themselves go back beyond that one chapter and only the next morning. And then they have to write the next chapter and then they come back and work through the progress. So ultimately, AutoCrit's built so that you can approach this process however you want. If you want to
Yep.
do one chapter at a time, you can do one chapter at a time. You want to do the whole book at one time, you can do the whole book at one time. If you want to turn on your dialogue and ignore editing dialogue while you edit narrative and then come back and edit all your dialogue later, you can do that. We are built to be flexible for all different editing types. You just have to find which groove, like Kevin said, keeps the creative juices going without stalling out.
Yes. Please finish your book. That's our goal at AutoCrit, right? We
Yep.
really want you to.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. It's been such a pleasure having you on. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Becca, on the chat. If you guys do have questions or you want to give AutoCrit a try, go ahead and grab it in the trial link that Becca shared and check us out. Go ahead and message us if you have questions. Take care, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
y'all.